Hey, Nikki. It's Chris. Chris Watts, the guy you said you liked. yeah. Hey.
And say to hell with it and drive away and never look back.
And go where?
I don't know. Figure it out when I get there. How about you? Where'd you rather be?
You kidding? Right here, right now. No place I'd rather be. Girls, I love this place.
Girls.
Oh, Belle and Cece.
Your dad.
Yeah. Here.
Okay.
That's Bella.
Oh, cute.
Cece's on the right.
And you're married. Why don't you wear a ring?
Separated. We live in the same house, but like, I sleep in the basement, like, just trying to sell the home, you know, keep things cool for the kids. So, hey, would I lie to you?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In this episode we'll deal with what was wrong with the Chris Watts Confessions of a Killer movie that showed on Lifetime on Saturday, January 25th. Also want to do a follow-up dealing with what they got right, and I think people might be quite surprised at that. But first off, I didn't share the Westward reporter's view that the filmmakers blamed Thrive. To be honest, although this was depicted a few times, my impression is that the reporter was trying to gain traction for a story on a sensational angle. The strive/thrive aspect is very secondary, very much in the background of this story. I think if you're new to the Watts case, then maybe noticing Shanann's promotional activity, which is dramatized occasionally, is going to seem like a big thing. It isn't. In fact, it's hard to say what the big thing is in this film. I don't know what the big thing is that the film is trying to point out. Is it that Watts is a liar, that is a two-face, that it is all about Kessinger? There's virtually nothing about the finances, not very much about the pregnancy. And as I say, the Thrive aspect really isn't. You don't sort of see Watts taking pills and sweating and his face sort of transforming or anything like that. It's really not nearly as front and center as that reporter seemed to imply. So I really saw it as a non-factor. The main message of the film seems to be to say that everything we know about Watts and what he did is kind of fuzzy. That's not a contribution to the law surrounding this case. It's a weak concession and a cop-out. It's almost like the filmmaker said, look, we don't know what happened here. Nobody does. So let's not even try. You know, it's not up to us to figure this out. We're not investigators. We're not law enforcement. Let's just stick to his version. That's the safe way to go about it. Let's just depict that and make a story about the version that no one believes. Let them try to figure out what really happened. That's not our job. Now, as a narrator, I found the narrative of the Lifetime movie messy, disorienting, and chaotic. It's not chronological, it's not clear, and overall, as mentioned above, the film pays homage to Chris Watts' first version, with only a passing interest to forensic accuracy. There are quite a few little things that one could highlight. For example, in the dramatization of Shanann arriving home, which happens right at the end of the movie, Shanann doesn't remove her shoes. She's in bed 1 minute, then she's out of the bed. There's no carpet on the stairs either. But you know what I want to do in these mistakes that I'm highlighting are sort of look at kind of deeper issues. You may not agree with all of them. Some of them you might argue are subjective, where you might say, well, to me, the actor portrayed Chris Watts very well. So this is in certain respects a subjective view of the characters of certain characters. And bear in mind, from the perspective of someone who's written 10 books about it, you might listen and say, wow, you've written 10 books, I still don't actually agree with any of it, and that's your prerogative. I'm simply just providing my perspective based on my perspective, and if you feel differently, then maybe it's worth noting that. It's no surprise that the Lifetime movie is not accurate. It's there's not a hashtag Lifetime movie bad. There's a hashtag like that. There's not a hashtag like that for nothing. From a true crime perspective, Lifetime movies are really the last place you'd want to go to find a documentary style criminal investigation. But there is really a lot of value in dramatizations. When I first wrote the very first book in the series, this was before the Discovery came out. This was very early in September 2018. I kind of had to dramatize in my own mind. I think the correct term isn't dramatize, it's imagine. I do imagine things happening. I'd imagine, does this version make sense? Does that version make sense? And you're kind of playing with scenarios in your mind and trying to come up with the one that makes the most sense. And one of the early aspects that I dealt with was the fact that nobody heard anybody screaming. And that made me assume, obviously it was possible that information might come out later that a neighbor did hear someone screaming, or someone heard a dog barking, or someone saw something, or someone heard a sound. But very early on, it just seemed quite clear that nobody heard any screaming or crying or any sounds. And I took that as a very crucial first element of the crime. It seemed to me to show premeditation. It seemed to me to show a silent kill. It seemed to me to show a kill inside the home, and so on and so on. So that is the kind of value also in a dramatization, where the dramatization is going to show you something, and then you should sort of ask yourself, well, does it match up with what was seen and heard and said, and does it feel right? So there are two real areas that you want to look at for value, or the opposite, where something's not accurate. The one is depictions of family dynamics. Also, in line with that, the depictions of the characters involved, and then also the interrelationships between them. So you have this whole host of rich subjective interpretations of, what do these people look and feel like? What is the vibe of these people? And so one of the early criticisms is people didn't like the way that Shanann was depicted. They said she was depicted in a way that blames her. She was depicted in a way that she doesn't seem so attractive. She's depicted in all sorts of certain ways, and that's early criticism regarding this. And some people might say, I totally reject that. I think Shanann was completely good, or even if she was that way, you're wrong to depict it. I'm not going to focus on that, just because it's a lightning rod for criticism and attack and so on. So I'm just going to excise my analysis of that part and just leave it completely out. Just kind of like a dangerous area to tread. So, if you want to censor that, then censor it. Then just maybe another way of dealing with the Lifetime movie was just to almost like leave Shanann out of it completely. Just sort of deal with Chris Watts and Kissinger. I don't know. Maybe that was one way to go about it that would keep some people happy. I don't know. But for me, the part that I want to sort of talk about is how Chris Watts was depicted. And I'm going to go into that in this episode. And I still think, the movie exposes how misunderstood Chris Watts is. I think there have been some experts that have come out now saying Chris Watts is a narcissist and he's this way and that way. And everyone thinks they now know who Chris Watts is. And I don't believe that's true. I think giving somebody a label is the opposite of knowing who they are. And then the reenactments of the crime scene. By dramatizing a reenactment, you're kind of getting a sense of, does this correspond to what we know about Chris Watts? Obviously, again, if you don't know how this guy works, if you don't know how his mind works, then the reenactment actually doesn't really matter, because you're not going to know whether it makes sense or not. If you do have a handle on his psychology, you do have a handle of the dynamics, not only of him, but of the other people, you are going to get a sense that, yes, this does make sense. So, interestingly, the movie opens with out-of-focus footage of the child actors playing Bella and Celeste running through a garden and laughing, while news coverage of the disappearance provides a kind of voice-over narration. Emphasized in this montage is the notion that they seemed like a normal family. And that's something to think about. Were the Watts family a normal family? Was Chris Watts kind of a normal guy? Was Shanann a normal lady? Were the children normal? And you can say maybe they were. Were their circumstances normal? Was their home normal? Was their debt normal? Was their situation normal? And you might say, yes, it was normal. The only person who wasn't normal was Chris Watts. Another way of looking at that is looking at the other people, like Nicole Atkinson. She's a normal person, and comparing the normalness of the Watts family to the normalness of the Atkinson family, you can see it's very, very different. You can see how Nicole Atkinson lived and behaved and spoke, and everything, car that she drove, is all different. And you can apply the same thing to all the other people, Watts's colleagues, the neighbors, and so on and so on and so on. That is kind of how you determine whether they were normal or not. You can also link the Watts family to their own families. You look at the home of the Watts family in Spring Lake, and the Ruseks in Aberdeen, and look at the home in Colorado and say, is it the same? In any event, there's a close-up of the side of Watts's eye after the sort of montage of the children running in the news. And then you see a clip of his sandaled foot under a table, jigging up and down sort of nervously. And this is trying to convey Watts being restless and agitated, and that something's going on in his head and we don't know what it is. And this is Watts sitting in the cubicle prior to being interrogated. Then the voiceover shifts to Shanann's voice doing a Thrive promo. And she says, you have to set an example for your kids, so take that leap of faith. And you hear a child's voice echoing her words in the background, and Shanann laughs with delight. And there's this kind of cute and quaint sort of interaction between the fictional mother and daughter, where the child is sort of saying things while the video is being recorded, and Shanann loves it, and she's got kind of a sense of humor about it. It's up to you to decide whether you think that this is an accurate portrayal of that. Bear in mind, to me, this kind of evokes that 30-minute Thrive spiel on that Saturday morning in May with the whole family present. I mean, we know what happened there, and we know that Shanann kind of said, say hi. And there wasn't really that much talking besides that with the children or whatever. The children didn't really want to say much, didn't really want to volunteer much. So I'm not going to, as you've noticed, I'm not providing any visuals or screen grabs in this YouTube video. You can go to the original blog post on Crime Rocket for that to get the screen grabs. And the reason I'm doing it is just because there's been so much censorship, apparently. So I want to be safe and just provide a safe version to this whole sort of debate. But all of this seems to be showing how Chris Watts remembers his family. So he's remembering, according to this sort of script on the Lifetime movie, he's remembering Shanann doing this Thrive spiel, is remembering his children running around, is remembering the news coverage. And all of this is happening from the inside of the interrogation cubicle. That's the perspective. And as I say, I found this opening montage fuzzy and disorientating. It's a poor start. It's a weak start, as far as I'm concerned. Throughout the whole film, there's very little footage of the children. You never really get a sense of the personalities of the children, how they're distinctive to one another. You never get a sense of CC rampaging. You never really get a sense of Bella. You don't also get a sense of the family really interacting with the children. You don't really get a sense of the whole Watts family together doing something. In other words, you don't get a sense of the Watts family and of the roles of each player kind of in the Watts family. There are little fragments of it, but you don't really get a sense of the Watts family as a unit and then the Watts family broken, which I think is quite interesting. For the most part, they've excluded or left out, or there's a blurry allusion to the children. There is an exception where Bella sings My Daddy's a Hero in the car with Celeste beside her. The impression I got was that this was happening in North Carolina. I don't think that is actually where it did happen, but I think in terms of the dramatization, that seems to be suggested. I could be wrong, but and then you also sort of see Celeste sort of singing along, which didn't really happen in reality. And then there's also a brief clip of the children crying softly in the truck on the way to the well site. But there's virtually no dialogue from the children otherwise. You never hear any of the children saying daddy no or no daddy or whatever. They don't ask anything about their mother. So none of that is in the film. And then, spoiler warning, there are no dramatized scenes of the children on the driveway getting into the truck or of anything that happened at Survey 319. I believe there's another YouTube creator who seems to be saying that Lifetime have subtly put something in there to suggest that, but I didn't see that. So, I don't know. Now there's like a conspiracy around the Lifetime movie. There's literally absolutely no scene where a child that night is walking in the driveway. You don't even see the children coming downstairs. At most, you see the children looking through the railings of the of the stairway, and that's it. They don't say anything, and that's it. The next thing, they're in the truck and they are sort of crying, and that's it. There's no dialogue. There's no talking or anything. There's nothing dramatized at Survey 319 on the morning of August 13th. Nothing at all. Which again is also ironic. The sort of shock value of this case is what happened at Survey 319. I think to some extent, certainly the murders of all three family members is also the shock value, but I think equally it's the way that Watts disposed of the bodies. And pretty much none of that is dramatized, which in a way is, I think, wise from the filmmakers. I think the Watts case is in some ways a very simple case, and in other ways it's an extremely politicized, dangerous case, just because there are various interests involved and there's quite a lot of litigiousness going around in the background. And in a lot of cases, there's a certain amount of leeway that people get to talk about them. It's quite interesting that this is kind of being shut down with this particular case. If you look at the Ramsey case and the McCanns, there was also quite a bit of litigiousness. We're starting to see that now with the Watts case as well. The difference is, you sort of got to ask whose interests are trying to be protected, who's got all the money, whose money needs to be protected, whose reputation needs to be protected, and to what end. And you can kind of understand in the Ramsey case and the Watts case, it's sort of about, the Ramsey case and the McCann case, It was about wealthy, very respected people. People who had kind of their own vocations. In the McCann's case, doctors. In the Ramsey case, very respected businessmen. And that was the sort of cauldron of gold that needed to be protected. In the Watts case, you've got to say, well, what's got to be protected here? Surely not Chris Watts. And yet there seems to be something like that going on, except not on behalf of Chris Watts. So that's quite interesting that you've got that kind of activity going on in the background. I'm not going to go into it too much further, but from a legal perspective, the narrative device seems quite clever. So Lifetime have been quite crafty in telling the story from a very safe perspective. And what I imagine happened is they probably pitched the producers, saying, let's tell the story through Watts himself. We'll give the backstory from his perspective, the one that he gave during his own polygraph test. And in this respect, this is anchored in the discovery. In the discovery, there is a very extensive backstory from Chris Watts himself in the pre-testing phase, and that's on pages 581 through 596. So there are 15 pages of kind of backstory provided to Tammy Lee by Chris Watts. And that kind of forms the center, the core of this movie, which is Chris Watts is sitting in the cubicle in the pre-testing phase. He's talking to Tammy Lee. He mostly only talks to her, and he's now giving his version of everything that happened. And as we all know, he failed the lie detector test miserably, and what he said wasn't true. So the movie is really just dramatizing Watts's fake version, which to me has dubious value, but that was the attitude they took. And it seems as if the producers kind of said, look, we can't dramatize anything else because we're going to get into trouble. If you dramatize the version that Nicole Kessinger is more culpable than Watts has led on, then we're going to get into trouble from her. If we dramatize that anyway, any kind of version of that, they're going to get into trouble. And to be honest, I thought the angle they took was that this was sort of Thrive driven, and that they were going to really push that angle, and yet they really didn't. You see Watts taking a couple of pills, but it's really not connected to the fabric of the case in a very clear way. It's certainly not overemphasized as far as I'm concerned. So in terms of the pitch that I believe the writers gave, I think they said something along the lines of, okay, so let's sort of play this and dramatize what's in the cubicle, and then we do the whole story based on that, and then at the very end we'll provide the twist of the second confession, just the part of the second confession dealing with where he admits to killing the children. And we're not even going to dramatize that. In other words, we're not going to dramatize what Watts is saying. We'll dramatize Watts saying it, which again is like a cop-out within a cop-out. And then at the end, basically, and this is a spoiler, we'll show that you really can't know someone or whether what they say is true, which is a cop-out of a cop-out of a cop-out. And so that's how it's done. Most of the film is from Watts' perspective, and most of that perspective comes from the 15 pages of the outdated discovery relating to the first confession. None of that really bothers me so much. As you'll notice as I go through the 31 mistakes, the things that bother me are and it's the same thing that bothers me about, when I'm on Crime Rocket or elsewhere, people just constantly coming back with, well, he's a narcissist, psychopath, monster. People have this very vacuous, empty, a lot of people, not everyone, uninformed idea of how Chris Watts is who he is, how he's wired, how he thinks, how he behaves. In other words, the criminal the psychology of the criminal psychology. And I just have a sense that most people just don't have a clue about that. They're just so used to repeating, he's a narcissist. And I do think there's an element of that in the film, which you may agree with. If you agree with that aspect, you might say, where you see Chris Watts having the affair and cutting his wife off while they're having a conversation and being completely preoccupied with Kissinger and just kind of selfish. That is Chris Watts being a narcissist. So if that is how you see it, I think that is kind of how the movie depicts it. So in that case, you might really like the film. You might really like how it shows Chris Watts' narcissism. I don't know what you think about the depiction of Shanann being on sort of Facebook and saying you can have the life that you want and you can have what you deserve and you must just take a leap of faith. And, you know, do you want to thrive? Do you want everything you really want? Do you want to look more attractive? Because that's kind of what it's about, is looking nicer, being nicer, having nice things. Isn't that about narcissism? Or don't we want to talk about that? Because to me, if you want to make the argument about that, that reflects also on you. How much are you on Facebook? And no one really wants to talk about that. They want to talk about Chris Watts being a narcissist, but he's the only narcissist in the story. Nobody else. And not you, of course. You calling someone a narcissist doesn't make you a narcissist. You being on social media all the time doesn't make you a narcissist. You being very particular about what someone says about you doesn't make you a narcissist, just somebody else. And that's where I have a problem with it. The narcissism doesn't explain the criminal behavior, because everybody is a narcissist in some way. And you've got to be an extreme narcissist, like on the level of a celebrity, like Oscar Pistorius and O.J. Simpson. You've got to be an extreme narcissist, extremely entitled, for the narcissism to become a factor. And even then, it's not the most important factor. It's things like social death and other things like that. Anyway, I've spoken so much about that, nobody seems to care about it. But this movie is a place to potentially discuss this in a way where I think some people might see things in a different light, see things with a different perspective, see how when you actually act out a certain thing, it doesn't actually match the Chris Watts that we see and know. It's just somebody else. And that's the sense I got with the actor. I got the sense that the actor's quite confident, balanced, suave, charming. Even in his awkwardness, is kind of quite, is definitely more confident than even Chris Watts is, when Chris Watts tries to be confident. I feel like it takes a while for the chronology of the story to settle down, and although it has its moments, the whole film is ultimately a mishmash of scenes and flashbacks with very little in the area of authentic moments. One seldom has an aha moment where it feels like anyone's character is addressed, and that's the main problem. There's no character building, no arc, no real story to speak of. It turns out the fuzzy memory of the children in the garden is from Watts' head as he sits in the interrogation cubicle waiting for Tammy Lee to enter to do the polygraph test. For me, one of the best parts of the movie is the movie title. The graphic design does a nice job in showing the two faces of Chris Watts and how the two faces don't line up, skillfully represented. The whole film basically cuts back and forth to Watts remembering the events leading up to the murders while he's being questioned by Tammy Lee. In other words, 90% of the film is based on the first confession. The actor playing Agent Coder also plays a very, very secondary role to Tammy Lee, who's acted incidentally by the same woman who played the victim in the pit in The Silence of the Lambs. After the title image, the scene reverts to Watts doing his infamous sermon on the porch. While he's talking, dogs bark in the background. It's not bad. Same setting, same words, same clothing, same basic body language. Even the actor appears less nonchalant than Watts did during his sermon on the porch. Even though he's acting and didn't commit triple murder, this is an irony in itself. Once done with the interview, we see something we haven't seen before. Watts walks into the door and sits on the staircase. He's alone. He sits there for some time. We see the light moving through the windows beside the front door, showing the movement of time, showing the passage of time. You kind of get the sense that Watts is alone and lonely, and what's he going to do with his free time, and what's going on in his head. And there's this sort of shift of time and space, and then it cuts back to the interrogation cubicle, and Watts is introduced to Tammy Lee, who lets him know what he's in for if he chooses to lie to him during the polygraph. It's at this point that the chronology starts to settle down into something slightly resembling a narrative. And so about 30 minutes into this introduction to the film, I'm going to take you through the mistakes. I think I will put I'll pin a message to the video, just letting people know if they want to avoid kind of what I think and what I say in the first half hour, they can jump. You guys can jump straight through to the 31 mistakes, and I'll deal with those quite briefly. So the first thing that I noticed, I mean, there were other things before this, but the first thing that really made an impression was the heaviness in the pregnancy announcement. I've looked at that many times. I know many of you have as well. And there's kind of a heaviness, a broodiness, a darkness to that moment. When he smiles, it doesn't seem to be a genuine smile. It doesn't seem to be genuinely excited. He doesn't seem to know what to say. I mean, he's on camera and he's sort of awkward. Shanann also seems strange. She's sort of in the background, kind of mute, kind of putting him on the spot. And I don't know whether she's nervous or anxious, but there's something going on in the background to that video, and Lifetime doesn't capture it. Lifetime just does the veneer and does it quite badly. And this kind of just shows why you need someone who knows the nuances to sort of execute this in a way that's going to be authentic and satisfying. I mean, how do you capture that heaviness? So the amazing thing is, even though Lifetime had the actual video to play off, to copy, to sync with, even the actors had that to refer to, and they even had detail in it, they still don't get it right. And I find that an incredible indictment of shockingly shallow filmmaking, and just, I don't know, the shallowness of people trying to show something that they just don't know. I guess they don't know what they're showing. So of the two actors, I thought Shanann acted that better. But it's also hard to say why it's not right, why it's a mistake. It's hard to be clear about that. I'm going to try, and I'm going to kind of be spending the most time on this particular detail. So Dita is in the room and at Watts' feet when Shanann announces she's pregnant. She's wearing the right shirt and he's dressed the right way too. But this was the first sign of the filmmaker's poor intuitive grasp of the subject material. Not only is the venue in the house wrong for where the spiel was recorded, they kind of seem to have it in the hallway with a door in the background, and it's not. It's sort of around the corner. But Chris Watts appears genuinely excited. The fictional Chris Watts appears genuinely excited. His smile looks real. Maybe it's not the actor's real smile, but it certainly looks more real than the fake, than the real Chris Watts. He looks genuinely excited and genuinely happy about the pregnancy. Again, far more so than the real Chris Watts did. The actor does a convincing scene appearing enthusiastic about his movie wife's fictitious pregnancy. Bear in mind, these are actors acting that this actress is pregnant, but she's not. And yet that scene is more kind of convincing than the actual scene on camera of an actual pregnancy, if that makes sense. It's so ironic that actors got it right in a bear in mind what the point is of the video. It's supposed to tell everyone how happy the Watts parents are about their happy news. And those representing that do a better job than the actual people, in my view. I don't know what you guys think. So what I thought what was needed was for the heaviness in the dramatized Sermon of the Porch, because there is that kind of darkness in his face. There's not so much smiling. There's something there which the actor does capture. That needed to be more manifest here. And for the nonchalance and lightness here to be more evident in the Sermon on the Porch. So he's kind of gotten it the wrong way around. I don't know whether that's intentional, whether they're trying to, whether they think this is clever acting or clever filmmaking, but if it is, it doesn't work. It's kind of confusing. So with a fake Watts says, I guess when you want it, it happens, there's no trace of the awkward Chris Watts. There's no trace of that sort of weak smile, weak, unconvincing smile. Instead, it actually seems quite natural and even charming when acted out by this guy. I mean, he looks quite handsome. It looks like a happy moment. And that brings us to number 2. And I'm also going to spend a little bit more time on this compared to all the others. We see Chris Watts at the well site. I assume that he's with his boss, Luke Epple, although that's never, I'm not sure if anyone's name is mentioned. It's not obvious that it's his boss if it is his boss, but a lot is crammed into the scene. It's a short scene. Watts describes his weight loss and exhorts his co-worker to contact his wife and start thriving. So you can, if you, that Westward report, you might say, wow, it's this constant focus on Thrive. Not really. I mean, Thrive was very much part of the fabric of the Watts case. It certainly wasn't like front and center the way that in this movie, in a way that the Westward reporter seems to show. I think it was far more front and center than the way the movie is shown. And that's why I'm quite surprised the reporter seems to be emphasizing it when I don't really think the movie emphasized it. I thought the movie touched on it and referenced it. In this little scene, Watts loses his ring, which is true. He said he did lose his ring, and his co-worker retrieving it says, did you forget something? His co-worker also mentions Nikki in the context of safety and hands Watts a gift card to treat his wife, which I just don't think happened in real life. I really don't think any of those events happened the way they're depicted here. Maybe they are doing a bit of license just to cut through a lot of or touch on a lot of the evidence. But the way Watts got these gift cards just is not the way it would have happened. Watts also mentions his wife being pregnant and hoping for a boy. That's an aspect that's supposedly kept secret from everyone at work except his boss. So this aspect then does seem to imply that it is his boss, that Watts would have told his boss about it. But this is definitely an area where the dramatization starts to raise legitimately interesting questions, such as, didn't Watts' colleagues know that his wife was pregnant? And so in this dramatization, you see one colleague knowing that, and then you can kind of say, well, wouldn't this guy have told his colleagues? And if he told his colleagues, wouldn't everyone have known that Chris Watts was going to be a father? And if everybody knew Chris Watts was going to be a father, wouldn't Kissinger have known, right? So that would have also made a very interesting drama or thought process, right? Of course, it's absolutely fraught because you would have to deal with Anadarko if you went down that road. But you kind of have a possibility within a possibility there. So I can hear some people saying, sort of waving their flags, clapping hands and saying, you see, Kissinger knew that he was pregnant. you see, I mean, if all his co-workers knew, why wouldn't he know? And because I think everyone wants Nicole Kessinger to be guilty, that they want her to be an accessory, right? There is a counter to that, and the counter is, well, what's worked in a male-dominated workplace? So it's possible that his co-workers, the males, did know that his wife was pregnant, and that he'd kind of sworn them to secrecy. Please don't tell, Nikki about my wife. And then maybe they didn't. We don't know whether that's true or not, but that's also a possibility worth thinking about. And all of that is open through opening this door of him telling his colleague about the pregnancy, and that he was hoping for a boy. In the scene, Watts appears, again, way too balanced, confident, and chatty. He's sort of the leader out of this pair of co-workers. Anadarko is also not mentioned here, and the logo isn't the Anadarko logo. I don't know what logo it is, but it's kind of a fictional logo in the same way that the Strive logo is fictional. But Watts kind of isn't the Rain Man Silver Fox that is depicted in the Discovery or through the versions of his co-workers. This Chris Watts is really balanced, he's confident, he's chatty, he sort of opens up with lines of conversation, he's enthusiastic, he's kind of very assertive. And it's not the introverted Chris Watts that we see otherwise. This is a different Chris Watts. And as I mentioned earlier, the gift cards at Anadarko, which is never named, as I say, Anadarko is never named in the film, and the well site and the 4 white tanks are nothing like the actual Survey 319. In the fictional version, they're trees, they're 4 tanks, they're quite a lot taller and kind of narrower, and there's not that kind of dusty rural setting, flat rural setting. This is more of just a different setting. And so, just coming back to the gift cards, they're not allocated as actual gifts or favors. They're not like handed out like, in this sense, I think he gave it out for Watts to take his wife out to dinner. But one doesn't get the sense that Watts earned it. And I don't think they would just be given out on site that way. Maybe so, but one kind of gets the idea it would sort of come out with his paycheck or some other way, but not in a sort of informal way. One gets the idea that these gift cards are earned as a result of safety milestones that are clearly identified. And now we start moving on a little bit to Nicole Kessinger's introduced, and she gives Watts her card. It's not a gift card, but one does also wonder, she was involved in safety. Was she able to allocate gift cards to him? And maybe if he was earning a lot of gift cards, maybe that's how their relationship sort of started. Maybe that's how they met, is that she kept seeing his name, this guy being so good with safety, and she maybe had to sign them off. I don't know whether that's true. I just know Kessinger was in charge in a way of safety. Not in charge, but that was her role. And so maybe she was involved in the allocating of cards. We don't know that. I'm just saying, once again, the movie opens the door to that discussion and that idea. Now, in the context of Nicole giving Watts her card, and the card that she's giving him is her personal card. I don't know if it would be a business card, but basically just a card with the contact details. That kind of thing's also not very believable, because people don't give out their business cards these days. They give out their phone numbers. They send their cards digitally. That's kind of how it happens these days. So even that's not very credible. In any event, in the run-up to this, you kind of see, so I've given it to you out of order. Kissinger gives Watts her cards after a certain thing happens. And the thing that happens is we see Shanann doing her like a Facebook Live or taking a video of herself on her phone, and then Nicole comes over and she's still on her phone. The whole time she's kind of on her phone, and you see the Thrive patches, and maybe this also triggered our friend from Westward. He's just not used to seeing these patches. Maybe hasn't seen a lot of the videos. In any event, then she leaves for North Carolina, and for me, this was the most authentic moment in the whole film. It's where Shanann leaves him, and then you see the house in front of him, and it's just Watts and the house sort of looms closer and closer and closer. And this is such a powerful moment, because that is very symbolically true of what happened in this case, is that Watts was left alone. He was left alone with his house, and I think the house was sort of like a burden to him. It was this big thing looming over him, and it sort of represented, I think, the burden of Shanann and the children in different ways, the emotional burden, the financial burden at the time, and the burden that they would be if he got divorced. And I think, when you look at him looking at that house, he didn't spend a single night at the house after Shanann left. He basically stayed over at Kissinger the entire time. And I think it's because he didn't want to be there. The house reminded him of the cratering finances. The house reminded him of the unsustainable future that he was sort of locked into, and he knew he was. The house reminded him that things were desperate, and he wanted to get away from it. He wanted to escape his obligations in terms of the mortgages and the debt and all that kind of thing. So the way the story is staged is really simplistic. It's the moment after Shanann leaves, Watts is left alone, and then he meets Nicole Kissinger. So it's very chronological in this sense, and the other chronology, I believe, is wrong. It's like Shanann leaves, and then Watts meets Kissinger, and then things happen kind of instantly. So Shanann's gone, he meets Kissinger, they click, and again, the Chris Watts that's dramatized here is very balanced. He's kind of modest. Is kind of understated, but is very balanced, and is very it's sort of quite a, I won't say a romantic moment, but it's a moment where he comes across as quite charming. And so you have this encounter in her office where, in the space of from nothing to, they've never met before, ostensibly, to he flirts a little bit with her, she flirts back, and it goes from 0 to 100 in like 2 seconds. And she says, "Call me if you need me, or even if you don't need me." And then that brings us to point number 4. Chris Watts is home alone watching porn. There's virtually nothing to substantiate that. There's very little linking Chris Watts to porn anywhere. I'm not saying it's not relevant. I'm just saying it's not substantiated in the discovery. And again, it's just a very simplistic and quite kind of sexist depiction. His wife leaves, and then the next thing is at home watching porn. And so I guess one can say here he's sort of getting stimulated. You don't see him taking Thrive at this point, which would be the obvious time to take it to sort of make the case that all of this is because of Thrive, but you don't really see that happening. Then number 5, he's bored, so he picks up the phone and calls Nicole Kessinger. That's the kind of confidence trickster Watts is. Just doesn't support his actual character whatsoever. And it kind of makes sense, this moment where Kessinger would later ask him, have you done this before? And the way that it's depicted suggests that Watts has done it before. He meets someone, flirts, she likes him, he picks up the phone and he calls. That's not the Chris Watts that I think is very likely. Just because he's a bad liar, he's a bad actor, and he has no game, kind of thing. Point number 6, they meet up in a wooded area. That's not necessarily a mistake. We know that they met in a particular park. I don't really get the sense that they were hiking. In the dramatization, they seem to be kind of going for a walk. And it seems quite active. I don't really get that same sense. It's not the way that I thought of it. So it's not necessarily a mistake, but it's just a little bit different. There's no sort of look into her green eyes that he referenced in the one letter. Number 7, in this park, that's where she finds out he's a dad and he's married, but she still wants to see him. That actually happened in the office, but maybe for reasons of legalities, they don't want to depict that. Number 8, at one point, Watts says, I'm out with the guys. And he also hangs up on Shanann. I think at that point he's at a restaurant with Kessinger, and Shanann kind of believes him, but he's never out with the guys. Chris Watts is never like out with pals. We never see him doing that. Shanann is kind of doing that. He's never really doing that. He works and then he's home and he does chores. And if he hangs out with anyone, it's with Shanann's friends. And the only kind of guy that he does stuff with is Nick Thayer when he goes running. Other than that, he doesn't really seem to have much of a private life with private pals. Certainly not pals plural. Then number 9, there's once again a nod to the assertive Chris Watts, this other Chris Watts who seems to sort of ravish his mistress in the back room of a restaurant. And he kind of tells her, come here. And it's just not, to me, very realistic. It might be, this sexual side of Chris Watts might be a side that we just don't know about. But it's hard to imagine him doing this in a public place. I kind of get the impression that it was the woman who led set the pace and led the charge when it came to him. Then number 10, I can't quite remember the exact circumstances, but I think Kessinger says to him, the fictional Kessinger says to him something about, are you judging me? And he answers, yes, I'm judging you, in a very emphatic way. It's also just not how I would expect him to behave. I wouldn't expect him ever to say those words, to be honest, let alone in the way that he said them. Just doesn't sound like him. And one should also notice the sleep mask in the background when this is happening. Then number 11, there's the visit to the Watts home. Cindy is not depicted at all, and there's absolutely no depiction of Nutgate or any reference to it whatsoever. There are no nuts, no Cindy, no drama, none of that. So that's all not there. And that's probably also just Lifetime being careful that they don't get into trouble with that as well. And I think that's quite interesting is, and I have that problem as well, as a storyteller, you're trying to tell a story, and yet the people involved are going to attack you, launch lawsuits against you, sue you, go after you if you simply try and tell the story the way that you think is the way that the story happened, right? So just saying a story the way that you know it, you can get sued. Of course, that's not really how defamation law works. If you tell the truth and you know it's the truth, you can't be sued. You can't be sued for telling the truth. Of course, you've got to know what, sorry, not, well, first of all, yeah, you've got to know that the truth is the truth, but more important, you've got to be able to prove that the truth is the truth. That's the issue. If you can't prove that, then you can be sued for defamation. So point number 12, Lifetime makes a very weak reference to Nutgate by saying, by depicting Shanann calling Watts to say, well, she doesn't want the kids sleeping over at his folks, but she doesn't say why. Then number 13, you have Dietergate, except Dieter's not in it. That's kind of a small, I guess, omission. In the story that we know, she arrives at the house and Dieter leads her upstairs. In this version, she just sort of enters in the hallway. She doesn't really look around. They're not in the house for very long. She just looks at a sort of a picture that's right in the hallway. She's initially smiling and almost pleased and, you know, impressed. And then she starts getting second thoughts, and she says, why would you leave all of this for me? And then she kind of gets distressed and wants to leave. And that's also not what happened. Kessinger kind of sat in the car, and Watts said he had to talk her down, and, you know, they kind of seemed to communicate via phone, even though she was just outside, for I think half an hour, and that was Dietergate. And that was all about her wanting to be first, you know, and that's not really mentioned that she wants to be first, but this scene does sort of symbolize it. Again, it's an important scene, but it's not really dramatized very much. You don't see her going upstairs, you don't really see her going through the house, and I think Lifetime are careful not to overstate anything, because they could get into trouble. Number 14, Nicole Kessinger stalking Chris Watts on Facebook. It's interesting that you don't see her on Shanann's Facebook page, which would have made more sense. And then the question arises, does she know Shanann's pregnant? This question's never hinted at or dramatized. So it's just not even mentioned, the fact that does Kessinger know Shanann's pregnant. It's also a legal minefield. If you say that she did know, can you prove it? If you say that she didn't know, can you prove it? We do know that, according to Kessinger, she found out when it was mentioned in the news, and that is dramatized. Number 15, Watts reconciles with Kessinger by picking her some yellow wildflowers. So this reconciliation is following her coming to his house and feeling like she doesn't really have a part in his life, and she was actually right. Her coming to his house and asking, you know, how and why would you want to leave this? And she's kind of right about that as well, because he didn't know how to leave it. And in the dramatization, he just gives her some flowers, and then it seems like that does it. There were actually 2 visits to his house, not just one. I think one of them also involved a meal and some other things. Number 16, they go camping next to a lake, and after Googling when to say I love you, he tells her he loves her. And although some of the clothing corresponds to what they really wore, they didn't camp next to a lake. I don't think him Googling this when to tell someone I love you actually happened from the Sand Dunes National Park. I don't think that's actually when it happened. I think, or not the way that it's depicted doesn't seem very authentic. In fact, the Google search when to say I love you, and there's another one when to say I love you for the first time in a new relationship. There's also another one, what do you feel when someone tells you they love you, and how does it feel when someone says I love you? That was that took place over around about 3 hours between 8:41 and 12:07 on July 25th. And that was 3 days before they went to the Great Sand Dunes. So while the dramatization shows it happening at the Great Sand Dunes, it actually took place 3 days before that. And when Watts actually said it, I think was just before he left for North Carolina. So around about 4 days later. A lot of people have criticized Watts, saying he can't possibly know about love if he had to Google it. But I think a lot of people Google lyrics and romantic statements and funny comments which they put on their social media and which they send to one another. So I think people saying that Watts didn't know what love felt like, so he had to Google it, I think is just trying to find a way to inform the whole narcissism and what's the other thing, sociopath thing. Actually, it was Watts going to a bit of trouble to try and find reinforcement for what he was feeling. He's someone who feels things, but he doesn't know how to express it, which is typical of an introvert. And so he's trying to find words because he wants to convey what he feels. And there's some people that don't do that. There's some people that if they like someone, they don't go to that much trouble. And in this case, Kissinger found it quite charming. And what this shows is that Watts felt a lot for this particular person, not the opposite. Not that he felt nothing, and not that because he felt nothing, he Googled something so that he would know what to feel. People have got it completely the wrong way around. And so I'm not going to take it further than that. It's already an hour. So we've basically gone through half of the mistakes. And so if you want to view some of the screen grabs that are depicted, that I'm talking about, you can visit the original post on Crime Rocket. What I'll be posting on Patreon is an analysis of the dramatization in the Lifetime movie right at the end of the crime, which is, I guess, the most controversial aspect of the film. Also the most, I guess, the crucial evidentiary aspect, the most criminal aspect that is depicted. And we're going to look at that, and I'm going to give you the True Crime Rocket Science treatment of why it doesn't make any sense. So that's on Patreon/TCRS. If you want to get part 2 of the 31 mistakes, please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment. Please in particular share on Facebook, and I will see you guys next time.